Welcome back to the Papers Podcast, where we review the health professions education literature, and the number needed to listen is 1, because we've got it all here for you. Hey, listen, today's a special podcast. It's Jason speaking. I've got Lara here.
Hi, everybody.
She's just back from Vegas, and she's really poking already. You'll see. Linda, welcome.
Yeah, and Lara has all her teeth. Hi, everyone.
I know, so she didn't have enough fun. This is John's episode, but we're not going to let John speak yet because yesterday was the Super Bowl, and today is John's birthday. So we have a little special treat for you all. You might want to cover your ears.
Me.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, John.
Hey, dear John.
Happy birthday to you.
I love you all. But if I have to listen to that again, I don't plan to make it to my next birthday. And I'm sorry, dear listeners. This is not a gift to me, and it's certainly not a gift to you.
Love you too, John.
Jason, you don't give up your day job, please.
On that fearsome note, John actually has a paper today, and take it away, John.
Well, we'll transition in a way that I don't know that's possible to do it with any kind of elegance, but to say, let's just pretend the previous 20 seconds didn't happen, and let's go cut a new take. I have a paper that I've entitled Getting into Medical School, What Counts and Why. It is by friends of the show. Meredith Young is the first author, and it is in Advances in Health Sciences Education, hot off the presses in December 2023. The official title is An Exploration of Values in Medical School Admission Processes, the interplay between contextual factors, admissions, practices, and validity. And wow, when I saw validity in the title, I thought, you know what? This is my paper, and I'm sure Lara is going to just love it. Now, getting into any kind of professional training school is a very stressful process. And I'm not going to tell you anything that's new when I say that, dear listener. Whether you are a nurse, a physiotherapist, a physician, or even in graduate school, if you are an education scholar or researcher, that's not a surprise. But I'm curious to hear from each of you, Jason, Linda, Lara, what was your experience like in terms of admission process where you felt your future academic or professional trajectory was held hostage by this anonymous, seemingly opaque selection process? What did admissions feel like?
Oh, admissions felt very nerve-wracking. I'm sure everybody feels a little bit of stress. I was naive about the process. I was really surprised to get in anywhere, both getting into med school and getting in matched to emergency medicine, which I eventually did. I also had applied for a grad degree, like most of us on this podcast. But I had no problem with the paper stuff. You write your essay, why I want to be a doctor. That's no problem. But I was so nervous in interviews. I think I accidentally shouted a couple times. And to this day, I still relive those interviews.
I would pay a lot of money to get the video feed for your admissions interview.
Honestly, yeah.
Well, yeah, I've got to say my admissions processes weren't all that bad. In fact, I was able to get admitted and then decide I wanted to delay for a year, and there wasn't a big fuss about it. But that was like back several millennia ago. And I know that now to get into any sort of important health profession schools, you've got to be a Rhodes Scholar and an Olympic athlete and play for a major symphony and be Mother Teresa. So bottom line is, I don't think I'd get in these days.
Same.
I feel you there for sure.
So my experience in applications was really different in the sense that when I applied for my master's degree to get into my master's program, there was no real application process. I sent in a CV and a handwritten form. That was that one. So it felt very luck of the draw, lottery sort of thing. And then but my PhD was a really different thing because I wanted to start my PhD while I was still living in Sweden. And this was before Zoom, before telework, before any of that. So I had to leverage relationships I had at the institution to have the ability to get in. And I was so lucky that I had people who were willing to be my champions. And so, yeah, that was a completely different thing. So if the first one was complete blind luck, the other one was who did I know who could pull for me?
I think your stories all resonate with me. The two things I would add to our conversation is the process sometimes became problematic. So I was backpacking when offers of admission came, and this is back before internet and before email, and I'd phone home, every couple of days and ask my father to open the mail and see what it said and send by return mail my tears or my excitement. And then the whole process didn't seem to, it felt very opaque to me. In one institution, I went into the back lab of a wet lab and met the professor emeritus and told some jokes, and that seemed to make him laugh. And I presume that's how they offered me an admission to a school I did not accept because I thought, this is not right. And of course, McMaster decided to, study me and move me through all these stations I felt like I was in some kind of laboratory setting where the anthropologists and the sociologists were on the other side of the one-way glass, evaluating my primate behavior with other primates in the room. And so it just felt so much was out of my control. And certainly, if you imagine that was successful in becoming a physician, that it was probably more luck than any kind of process or ability on my part.
John, I had the same interview at that school. I remember going to the emeritus anatomy guy, pathology guy, and I was so distracted by all the things in little glass jars behind him that I'm not sure I did well at that interview. I was a bit scared, actually.
A legitimate thing was, tell me a joke. And I was like, oh boy. Do I make a funny joke that's maybe off color and inappropriate? Do I say nothing? Like, is this a trick if I'm too casual? And I didn't know how to answer it. I was like, knock, knock. Who's there? Not me, because I can't get into the school.
Too funny.
Anyway, so let's get into what I think most of us would understand would be the admissions process, where there's some kind of data, the content about the candidate, and a process, how that data is used for selection, that defines medical school admissions. And if that's what you believe, then you probably have a very black and white view of the world. We're probably getting a little bit more refined now. We might talk about a bit of validity evidence, and I have a contractual obligation to say that all the time. But that's the idea of what are the proofs, both theoretical or empirical, that how you score your data or generalize it or extrapolate it to future performance as a student, or the implications for choosing and selecting you into it. How do you support the assumptions about how you put everything together in your system? And that's more emerging. But this paper by Young et al. Goes beyond that. It gets beyond this so-called objective idea of a system and gets to the hidden, but I would argue perhaps central drivers of how admission systems work. What do the institutions value? And do they talk about it explicitly? And so I would say that this paper is important because before we can even begin conversations about professional identity and what it feels like to become a health professional, or discuss issues of what does equity and diversity in our education systems look like, we need to understand how is the system setting those conversations up, because it becomes foundational in terms of setting out the environment in which all these other really important sociologic factors of health professions education come into play. And so the purpose of this paper from the authors is as follows. We use data generated through interviews with those responsible for designing and monitoring admissions processes to explore the values at play in medical school admissions, quality monitoring practices, and the corresponding standards of excellence. In other words, I think what they're trying to do is pull the curtain back and say, what are the values, the unspoken and implicit features that drive how the data and how the data assembly in our admission processes actually work? Now, let's turn to methodology. And at this point, one of two things are going to happen. Either Lara's going to be very, very, very happy because we're choosing a methodology that I know that she probably has a secret hot crush on. Or she's going to be very, very mad at me because she's going to say, that was the grossest misrepresentation of this important methodology. And how dare you tackle it? So I did a chart and I did some stats. And no, I'm not. I didn't do that. The methodology employed by the authors, I think, works really well. It's phenomenography. And yes, I did practice that a couple times before we started the podcast, so I could say it once. I'm not sure if I'll get it right a second time. And essentially, phenomenography is a qualitative methodology that looks at how an individual will understand or experience or even conceptualize an idea. And what it tries to do is to map the range of possible conceptualizations that exist within a particular group, but resist trying to focus on quantifying any of these. So it's very interested in the variation in the system rather than in where does the central perspective lie. So here's the too long, didn't read version. Phenomenography produces a conception that's a broad mapping of the landscape of how ideas are brought forward, how people understand or experience these different tenets, which is slightly different than when we see some other types of qualitative methodologies that tries to produce themes that within a theme, you'll have embedded kind of what is the aggregated experience? How can we cluster or move together the perspectives to say, here's what dominant or themes are, whereas phenomenography is trying to find all the variation of these conceptions through it. I'm going to pause there. And any comments from Linda and John, because I can see Lara just putting her hand up like that kid at the front row saying, ooh, teacher, pick me. I'm going to show you how smart I am about phenomenography. Any refinements or any further questions you'd want about this methodology before I get into the meat and potatoes?
Did you just call me John? Because I'll take it as a compliment most days.
Okay. Well, your name badge on our screen is throwing me off. Maybe that's why it is. Anyway, Jason, Linda, and then the good Dr. Varpio.
Listen, I really enjoyed this paper. I love the idea of surfacing values so you can have a conversation about argumentation. But I wonder if when Lara jumps in here in a second, can you also talk about the phenomenon of starting out with one methodology, switching to another, and then writing your paper and telling the world that you did that? Because we've got a couple of papers coming up that do that. This is one of them. And that was a head scratcher for me. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, and thank you, John, for explaining phenomenography. I hope I pronounced that right. It does make sense to use for this particular research question, because if I understand correctly, you want to get all of those, in this case, values out there, rather than trying to lump various comments within a more limited number of themes. Now, I may be wrong, and Lara, you can.
So there's no need to correct you, Linda. This paper is a gorgeous example of phenomenography. And I just want to give a small shout out to Teresa Stenfors-Hayes, who's at the Karolinska Institutet. She is in medical education in our sphere. She's the person I look to when I want to understand phenomenography. She's an excellent scholar, having used that methodology a lot. So big tip of the hat to Teresa for that. And she cited in this manuscript, I've got nothing but compliments about the description of the phenomenography of the methodology and those sorts of things. So instead, what I'm going to do then, Jason, is I'll tackle your point about how they started in one lane and then shifted gears. So the paper talks about how it started off wanting to do qualitative description. Now, and then how over time and with a new direction of inquiry, they decided to move over to phenomenography. I don't have a problem with that for two reasons. One is that qualitative description is a very straightforward, descriptive approach to articulating what you understand in qualitative data. Very low level of analysis in the sense of like low inference. It's very descriptive. It stays very close to the data itself. But what these authors are telling us is that by doing that, they realized there was a lot more underneath the surface, and they wanted to get into that. And the way in which they carried out their interviews, they gave us the protocol. There's no reason why they couldn't do it. Their protocol, the interview questions they asked, lent themselves to deeper inquiry. And so when they switched over to phenomenography, I had no concerns with that. Follows the same paradigmatic orientation. The data structure is allowed for it. The questions that they have within the data set and the research question, there's no reason why not. I actually appreciate the fact that they're candid about it.
So just maybe one more sentence about that. Talking about it in your manuscript, lots of people change their methods as they tackle a new study. Why talk about it? Why not just say we use phenomenography?
I don't know why. What I would imagine is that there's probably a reason why they felt the need to go into it. There's probably something that happened between the authors and the editors and that back and forth. And it could be as simple as at one point they might have written that we had IRB approval for qualitative description or something like that. Often it's just a throwaway comment that a reviewer will comment on, and then you're writing paragraphs of justification.
I have a different take on that piece, which is in the experimental world, you need to register your experiments, or at least you have to register your trials or your systematic reviews, so that you can't do a bait and switch later on and say, hey, look, we found this, which could be a matter of chance because you never went looking for it until you decided to beat the data to death to find some kind of difference. And so that's the check and balance. Maybe this is better practice to say, hey, here's how we tried to explore this thorny question. It didn't work this way, but in full transparency, this is how we shifted. And we found that this methodology was much more aligned and gave us the analysis necessary for us to make sense of what the data showed. And I think that's a best practice.
I think one of the things that we have to remember is that sometimes what we want to do is write the story of our research, to explain it, knowing that the reader doesn't need to go through all the hoops and jumps and loops that we did as scholars. We want to help them get to just because it took us all these curves and jumps and thinkings to get to this therefore statement doesn't mean that the reader has to follow every single step of the way. We can shortcut some of that for them. So that's one view on it. And I think that's a reasonable view. But it's also, I think, as you point out, equally reasonable to be a little bit more candid about the ebbs and flows of our research processes that we started in this direction, but we veered over there.
So what do they actually do? They recruited current or immediate past leaders of admission programs from all Canadian medical schools. They conducted semi-structured interviews in French or English with iterative coding to produce similar codes, categorized, and then eventually led to a common value. And then they produced an outcome space. And an outcome space is essentially an organized description of how the values, in their terminology, but really conceptions from a phenomenography point of view, are interrelated and connected. And here is where a picture is worth a million words, because I'm going to fail when I come to the outcome space to describe it, but I will direct the readers to the original publication in AZ or to our abstract where a portion of the outcome space figure is reproduced. What did they find? So they had 10 participants. That represents, nearly 2/3 or a little bit more than 2/3 of all Canadian medical schools, with good representation from the French schools and from English schools in Canada, which have slightly different contextual and social cultural approaches to education and selection. Interestingly, only a single participant had a specific admissions role training, with everyone else essentially bootstrapping, acquiring knowledge of the process through experience. And then they provide their outcome space. And here's where you almost wish you could follow along with the abstract. And if you're not driving or not working out, but you're listening to this podcast at your computer, you might want to pause this, go to paperspodcast.com, pull the abstract, look at the figure, and then you can rejoin us. And we're back, because maybe one of you did that. Essentially, they have 4 levels.
Dude, you totally judge them. Just saying, right?
well, they don't need. I'm sorry. It's my birthday. I'm a little bit.
You
delirious.
can be punchy. Go for it.
I'm a little delirious with all the smoke coming off my cake because there's a lot of candles here.
Right. In fact, I was going to suggest you get a fire extinguisher. You forgot one step in that step away step, John, and that is you practically need to get a microscope or at least a magnifying glass, because it's a relatively small and complicated diagram. There's a lot in it.
It is complicated. I would not get onto my usual rant about it being a poor figure. I actually think it works very well with a lot of visual representation of connection. So it's arranged hierarchically because they feel that there is a trickle-down effect of the connections. And so they talk at the first level is contextual factors. And I'm just going to list these briefly, and then we're going to talk about the values that really came out of this just dispersion of ideas. So geographic location, experience, knowledge of equity, access to expertise or collaboration, and resource availability. Those are all the factors that will have influence on how you can be as broad or as narrow-minded or as explicit or as creative in the type of admissions system that you might want to design. Then once you know what the landscape looks like in which you're playing, the values articulated and connected one to another are the following 8. And I'm going to read them quickly, but as you listen to them, what I think you need to understand is this is not an equal distribution. There is lots of interplay between respondents where their data informs a number of the different values. So there's an interrelatedness. And it would not say that these are all equally valued and that they might be specific to some institutions, but not to others. And this is what the phenomenography shows. They try to describe what the entire landscape looks like and how it all connects. And so here are the 8. Critically questioning the process and tools, aiming for equal representation and equal voice. Further values are striving for better. Another is embracing the challenges of change. A 5th is idealizing exceptionally good candidates. Meaningfully integrating multiple perspectives. And the final 2 are prioritizing quantification. And then we conclude with connecting with community. So the punchline is, and here's my editorialization of these 8, there are values that say we should continually question what is the process that's driving our candidate selection, what's underneath the hood. Another is, do we make sure that there is an appropriate representation, that there's equity and diversity and inclusion? What are the barriers that our candidates are experiencing? Another idea is a continual idea of quality improvement. How can we continue to advance rather than stagnate? Another is understanding that change is challenging, but we should embrace that challenge. Another value is we should find these really outstanding outlier candidates and prioritize a system to identify them. Another is that there's not a single way to select candidates, that we need multiple sources of data to include. There's 2 other ideas. One is that we need to quantify and take abstract ideas and numerically represent them. And then the idea is we need to be responsible to what the needs of our community are. So with all of that, we don't have time to jump into all 8 values. I'm interested, Linda, Lara, Jason, what are the values that stood up for you for further elucidation?
Well, I'll take meaningfully integrate multiple perspectives. But just before I go into it, I want to say the diagram, I just noticed something in the diagram, which I've looked at a number of times, and that is just below the values, there's a little a little sub-diagram that I could interpret as a balance, the little dots with lines on the top. And I've just now decided that I can interpret that as the individual school might have more or less of that particular value. I'm not sure, but I think that's what it means. Anyway, back to, yeah.
Linda, Lara and I decided those are eyebrows and eyes. And they're very serious.
And then concerned.
Yeah.
I think you're very concrete, and I'm very surprised that Lara is. Anyway, back to this meaningfully integrating multiple perspectives. I think I'd say this was kind of like programmatic assessment, because what they want to do in this value is to integrate perspectives from who is assessing, what roles the assessors play, how judgments are made, how training is done. I mean, to me, this sounds like they could be getting ready to do a competency committee rather than an admissions committee. But I do think that this is a really important thing. It shouldn't be just that crazy old emeritus anatomy professor in the back room, but it should be the perspectives of multiple people.
So I just absolutely love this paper. It is sitting right in the wheelhouse of things that I care about. In fact, a few years ago, I was honored to give a plenary at the AME conference and talked about the ideologies, the values, beliefs, norms that are embedded in our medical education, health professions education systems. This is right in that wheelhouse of things. This is a paper that highlights how there are values embedded in our decisions of who we admit. So the value I wanted to pick is prioritizing quantification, because it gave me a springboard moment in terms of an opportunity to think about something that I think is very relevant to this paper, but would probably be a study for a future date. Because I understand why we have to prioritize quantification or the quantification of different characteristics or attitudes or whatnot. For every spot that's available for a matriculant, there are hundreds and hundreds of applicants. So you have to have some way that is logistically feasible to cut that applicant pool down to a size that you can actually look at. So I understand the thinking behind the quantification. But I was also struck by the comment in the paper that while some participants talked about relying on the predictive powers of these scores, others talked about the limitations of those scores and how the judgments of applicants and test scores are not informed solely by numbers, but also by economic and social and cultural factors. So when I read these values and thinking about the quantification, part of me is asking, I would love to hear somebody next talk about the values that are embedded within the data, within the numbers that we use for application. The number of an MCAT score is a reflection of values, of ideas, of ability to take the test, of the time restrictions, the physical locations. And that's just one data point. I find myself thinking about all of the numbers that are part of our admissions processes and of the values that are embedded within them that we haven't started to think about.
I'm going to build on that. I also loved this paper. I love that it surfaces what's often hidden or implicit in a lot of these admissions policies. And it made me think and reflect on all of the people I've talked to who have a role in selection to various professions. A lot of my friends who do undergraduate selection are very serious about it, dead serious about it. They take it with great dedication. They have a lot of elaborate processes. They tend to talk about numbers a lot. And I wonder if that's a reflection of the pressure they're under, the big numbers they deal with, and the defensibility of their decision. My colleagues who work in the residency space and are selecting people for specialties, they tend to talk a little differently. They talk about fit. They talk about strong candidates, people who are compassionate and different than themselves. They talk about that diversity. And they talk about accountability, not so much as being able to defend to some angry parent, but more about accountability for somebody who's going to treat patients well and reflect well in our department. That's kind of a different reputational thing. So I really keyed on the idealizing the exceptionally good candidate. That was one of the values in this paper. And I wonder how much that varies around the world for a given school or program, but is so implicit and not articulated. One of the things I really admire about my own department that I belong to, I'm not involved in the selection process anymore, but there is a discussion. There's like a huddle before we do our selection, our interview day, and they have a discussion explicitly floating out, what are we looking for? And we put words to it, and that helps everybody be aligned. And for example, one of the things is we're not choosing people who look exactly like us. We want people who are talented and will enrich our group in different ways.
So I'm going to continue with the final kind of description of the outcome space. So the authors find these values. They articulate and visually represent that there is at least 5 values out of 8 where each participant in the study, representing, more than 2/3 of Canadian medical schools, are successful in articulating or share in the articulation of that value. That there's some commonality across the Canadian admissions landscape. So below these values are the admission practices. I'll give you just some examples, but once you know what the values are, it tells you here's how we're actually going to put into place these implicit values that we may articulate or we may not. It may just all be internalized. It may be all kind of tacit shared culture that's not written down anywhere. And so these are the questions of, if you have certain values around questioning processes or aiming for equal representation, then what does your pipeline and your outreach process look like even before you get people to the admissions process? Or how do you blueprint and assess the different candidates? What are the tools you're using? And below this level of admission practices, then it becomes the idea of validation or justification. How are you then using other tools and processes to say, okay, our system is working? And so these are an example of what is the prediction of what future performance will look like? Or what's the defensibility that Jason kind of articulated? How can we say that, yes, we are responding to our value of connecting with community? How do we actually make sure that we are capturing that and being responsive? And so all of this, of course, leads to a single outcome, which is offering an individual admission to that medical school. There's so much goodness here. We would need a 2-hour podcast. We probably need more than a 2-hour podcast to get through it. So I'll just leave it as a bit of a teaser, listener, that if you are excited about admissions or concerned about admissions, then I think this paper will give you a lot of food for thought and may open up your own lines of inquiry or give you some reveals, just like Lara suggested. Let's go to the conclusions before we get to our votes. And I'm going to quote the authors because I think, it's probably wrong for me to editorialize too much about their work. Let's let them speak for themselves. They say, this study documents various values that influence admission processes. The values that shape what and how fair and defensible our practices are conceptualized and how they have significant impact, ultimately determining who is selected. These values result in intended and unintended consequences in selection. However, these values are rarely explicitly examined and questioned, leaving it uncertain as to which consequences are the intended outcomes of deliberately chosen values and which are unintended consequences of implicitly held values of admission systems and their actors. Here's my little editorialization. I think the consequences of how we choose candidates for any health professions education is significant. And so I think we need to begin with that fundamental or rudimentary or foundational, whatever the synonym you're looking for, act of saying, what do we value? And from that, we know how everything else is going to shape out in terms of our practices and our systems. Here's a little paperclip before we go to our round of votes. I think this writing style of the manuscript is lovely. I've coined a new phrase because I'm not using gorge. I've decided that's been copyrighted. Also, I don't like it. So this is lovely. The chain of logic, the chain of logic, particularly in the introduction, is just so concise and clear and explicit. Okay, all right, Varpio, I know you want to call it a conceptual framework, and so fine, have your day in the sun, blah, blah, blah. Chain of logic in the introduction, it's great.
What are you patenting? Chain of logic?
No, just lovely. I'm patenting lovely.
You can't patent lovely.
You can't patent gorge. So hey.
Why not? Made it up.
Okay. There's also a subsection in the methods part where the authors talk about the rigor that they have in their research. And what it is essentially is it's a great primer that should be in any kind of introductory research methods course about, all right, here's if you don't know, here's how you know. And they just do it step by step by step using the classic references about what qualitative methodology rigor looks like. And then they use the example from their paper, and here's how we did that. And if you're struggling to say, what does rigor look like in the qualitative world? I don't have a user's guide to the medical literature that is helpful for me in my experimentalist positivist world. This is a great hack. This is a great little section that you might want to cut and paste. Jason.
I'm just wondering, do you think any other journal would have allowed that real estate? It was like, now for the workshop section of our paper. Right.
Well, it's an interesting thing. There's no word count in Easy. Which is, as always, Rachel Elloway, who is the editor-in-chief. Congrats, hats off to you for continuing to advance the usability of that journal. And I shouldn't say that it's exclusively. I think there's a number of other journals that don't have a word count limit. Why do we? Because none of us actually get a paper version. It's not a production issue. It's a concise piece. And I think they write their section very concisely with a nice argument that frames it through. All right, a round of votes. Methodology, 1 to 5. Let's hear it from you. Lara, just because you're groaning, I'm going to make you go first. Linda, Jason.
5.
5, particularly for the rigor part, but beautifully written.
Yeah, I think it's also a 5 too. I hate to be boring, but it's true.
All right, I don't want to gloat here, but it looks like I'm about to pitch a perfect game.
No,
okay, great.
No.
Yes, we're going here.
No.
We're going. I'm going to give it a 5. Hang on, listeners. Here we go. Coming the home stretch. Educational impact. We'll go reverse order. Jason, Linda, Lara.
So I don't know the admissions literature as much. So I'm going to qualify my next comment because I think this is a really important paper. I think the diagram that connects the logic of the values to some of the practices, like if I was an admissions dean, I'd be like booking a national call and saying, let's have a discussion about this. Are we on the right page? Do I need to do anything different at my institution? I think it's a high impact paper. I really encourage anybody who's involved in admissions to have a look at this. Not knowing how many others are as useful out there. I'm going to give this a 5, and I rarely do that,
We're coming home. All right. We're the perfect game's coming. Linda, don't disappoint.
Okay, we're getting closer. As well as what Jason said, I think that this is basically another way of looking at the hidden curriculum. You could take away the term admissions processes and put in, I don't know, exams or clinical learning or feedback or whatever you wanted and come up with the same kind of sort of visual concept map. And I do think it's important because it really does unhide that hidden curriculum. And I'm going to give it a 5.
Okay, so John's fist pumping. He's feeling like his life is about to be justified. So I'm going to.
You're friends with the authors, so
I am totally friends with the authors.
So it'll be a personal slight if you don't keep up this perfect game. I'm just putting that out there to you.
So I'm going to frame my ranking in terms that my dear friends will respect because they know how I feel about the ranking system. So I'm going to give this 3 bowls of poutine and 2 beaver tails. And they appreciate that right there.
And if you are not from Canada and wonder if Dr. Varpio just had a small stroke and has expressive aphasia, that's a 5. Like 3 plus 2 is a 5.
That's what I heard as well.
No, I didn't give it a number. Ergo, it's not a perfect game for you, friend.
All right. Well, Well, you got benched. You fouled off. You had an injury. And so I'm going to step up to the plate and substitute for you. The count is still 3-2, and I'm going to hit a home run because I think this is a 5. I don't read the admissions literature very much, but man, did they do a really lovely job of unpacking it from a theoretical point of view of the transferability. This is a Canadian, this is one ecosystem. This is an entire national approach. So there is not the limits of saying this is only contextualized in this one very small space. I think there's a lot of transfer in terms of their findings here. And I also think that they show the applicability of what these values mean. And they pull apart this really, what I experienced as a medical student many, many, many decades ago, which was a very opaque system, and say, let's get past the opaque and understand what's important here. And in doing so, they say, then what are the consequences of those collective decisions? And I think that's really important. So with that, you hear a perfect game, 5s all around. It's the first time this season that we've hit that.
But
it takes a certain host to drive that one home.
Here we go.
It's got nothing to do with the host. It's like it's like the opposite of a bad workman blaming their tools, and it's the authors. It's not the host. All
right, Linda, you're right. I am taking all of that hard work, which would be hundreds and hundreds of hours to do this type of research, and so a specific shout out to Meredith Young, Sneha Shankar, and Christina St. Ange for their excellent work. And with that, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at our email address, thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. You can find the show notes, which are essential for this episode, so that you can see the outcome space. You can find us on the interwebs at paperspodcast.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care. Samuel's entertained because he's got the whole Lara outtake episode.
Oh, there's
planned.
no Lara outtake episode.
There totally is a Lara outtake episode. Yes, it's going to be good. You wait till July.